Good afternoon. My name is Joe McGovern. I'm a second-year MBA student at MIT Sloan and the leader of the Hockey Analytics panel. I'm honored to introduce our guests today. Today we have Tyler Dello, Analytics Consultant for the Edmonton Oilers, Tim Barnes, Director of Analytics for the Washington Capitals, Frank Provenzano, former Assistant General Manager for the Dallas Stars and CEO and founder of Fans Eye Sports, Doug McKenney, founding coach at Coach Me Plus, and finally, Chris Kelly, forward and assistant captain for the Boston Bruins. Our panel will be moderated by Craig Custance from ESPN Magazine. The panel will run for 45 minutes and will leave 15 minutes at the end for questions. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so on Twitter using the hashtag HockeyAnalytics. The tweets with the most mentions will be asked by Craig to the panel. With that, I'll turn things over to Craig.
Thank you. I've got, I think, 3 hours worth of questions on this list, and I'm dying to jump in. So I'm going to go right at it here. And I'm going to start with Tim. The name of this panel is Out of the Ice Age, which to me implies on some level that hockey is a little bit behind other sports. And I don't know if that's true, and I want to start with you. Do you think the strides that hockey has made over the last couple of years has closed that gap?
Yeah, I don't think hockey has ever been as far behind as people say it is. And so in my experience, everybody's been very open to what I'm talking about. Everyone wants to have edge, and I think the game itself has been open to outsiders. I saw that with guys like Roger Nielsen coming into the game a long time ago. That he did a lot of really creative stuff, and I just it always feels like people talk about hockey like it's sort of behind the curve, but it's a harder game to measure than some other sports for sure.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any shortage of acceptance, and there's actually a lot of implementation. I think people are just wise enough to be keeping quiet about it.
So, Frank, you and I have had conversations where, we'll joke, we'll see something in the NFL or baseball and say, oh, I can't wait till that joins hockey in 10 years. Do you agree with Tim that hockey has eliminated that gap in terms of analytics?
I think we're past the point, of Brian Burke being up here and saying, drunk to a lamppost stuff. It's definitely arrived. It's a part of the equation. It's not going away, and that's a good thing. I mean, there's two guys on this panel that, spent a lot of time before it was sort of accepted, doing a lot of work, and now those guys are now inside the war rooms, where they should be.
Yeah.
And what's interesting for me is not so much, let's get past the discussion of, hockey is behind, and talk about where hockey's going.
We'll get there. Jeez,
All right.
Frank. So, everyone talked in hockey a couple years ago about the Summer of Analytics. That's when you were hired, Tyler, right? Is that why we named it? Because you got hired? It became the Summer of Analytics?
I think it was a bunch of people. I was one part of it, but it was a whole bunch of people.
And so that happens a couple years ago, and I think since then, what happens is you have a little bit of growing pains when you add thinkers that are a little bit different than you normally have in the sport into a front office. And I wanted to talk about a couple of things that I've heard in talking to teams, and one of them, this is fairly recent. A lot of players, a lot of younger players now are hiring their own skills coaches or their own analytics guy, and they're doing something separately that's outside the team function, where the team may have their own analytics guys. And so that guy that's hired by the player may be telling him something differently than what the team is telling him. And I want to bring in Chris Kelly here from the Bruins. First of all, do you have a personal skills coach you work with, and how commonplace is that among the players in Boston?
It's pretty common. I just started actually the last few summers getting a skills guy, getting a figure skating, doing a lot of those things, because every young player that comes in has been doing those things since they were 14.
Yeah.
And you see that now. The game's getting faster, more skilled. But it does put your coach in a tough spot if he's telling you to play one way and you're getting mixed messages from someone else that you trust and have seeked out to help you become a player, a better player. But I think at the end of the day, your job is to play for your team, your coach, and your system.
Yeah, so Claude has the final say.
Claude always has the final say.
Well, Doug, so I want to expand it out. I mean, you're gathering with Coach Me Plus, you're gathering so much data on individual players. And so now it becomes, if a player is gathering stuff on their own, or you're doing it through a team, who owns that data? Who's responsible for gathering it? Should there be two separate tracks in this world?
You know, if you'd asked me this question 10 years ago, it would have been an easy answer for me. Now, I think that essentially, I look at it completely different because the platform that Coaching Plus has allows me to track all this data for a player and turn it over to a personal trainer. And the relationship now becomes easier. I can go through, if we're talking about power when we're using Tendo units, or if we're talking about heart rates, you know, how are we measuring this load data? And if I'm turning it over to somebody and they have a full idea of what this training concept was for an individual player,
Right.
now that communication between me and him is grown, and I know whether or not he knows what he's doing, and I can tell that to the individual player. I can say, hey, you know, Chris, this isn't, you know, I don't know if this is going to work well. Now, if he's got a good relationship with him, I'm just going to work with him. You know, I'm going to help him get through this, but he's going to have to do this and this and this to elevate his level of performance and reduce his chance for injury. So 10 years ago, I probably would have said, well, I don't like the idea. Of course, you got to remember, we're biased to our own programs because, you know, we spend time with them. We learn about them. We know their strengths and their weaknesses. We hear what the coaches are saying about them, and we direct that information back and forth with each other so that, you know, when the time comes for me to develop and design and implement a program that's going to work specifically for him, you know, I'm biased to it. I believe in it. And so to turn it over, I'd rather have him stay and work here. But on the other side of the coin, you know, I also believe that these guys need to go home. You know, it's hard to stay and go 7 months out of the year going back and forth to the same rink, doing this, you know, and so I think it's great for them to go home, see their friends, their family, spend time with, you know, those away from the game. So change it up a little bit. So their personal trainer needs to be on the same page with us.
For sure. Yeah, Frank.
I think, though, you know, going back to the first question, where is it going? Chris brings up a good point in that, you know, his goal is to win hockey games for the Boston Bruins, but that is going to be an increasing challenge in my mind, coming from a management side, and I'm interested to see what these guys think. When the player analytics and the team analytics collide?
Right.
Or do they? I mean, have you guys run into that yet?
I mean, that's more of a coaching philosophy thing, not an analytics question. I haven't personally run into it, but I don't work on that part of the ship.
If a player's getting analytics from his personal guy, and they're telling him things that are running counter to what the coaching strategy is, that maybe is incorporating analytics, maybe is not. I mean, that's the difficulty, is aligning interests, right? It always is, whether it's in physical training or analytics or whatever it is.
I think at the end of the day, you know, you have a head coach because you need a boss, and he's got to be the one who makes those decisions. And you know, whether he's interested in getting that input or not, some guys are, some guys aren't. But I don't know how you can run a team where you've got 18 guys saying, "I think I should do this." Like, you know, at the end of the day, there's a strategy to these things, and I think the coach has to be the one setting the direction.
But like Mike Yeo gets fired from the Minnesota Wild, and one of the things he said in a media scrum afterwards, he referenced Adam Oates being in the stands. Adam Oates is not an employee of the Minnesota Wild. He's hired by the players to, I think, help with the power play. Like, would Claude be all right with you bringing in your own guy to check in on practice?
I don't think so, but that's a player putting the coach in a difficult spot.
I think so.
If it's one of your veteran players and one of your leaders, at the end of the day, I think he should know better and separate that if he's going to make things uncomfortable for his coach and his teammates.
Yeah. So another kind of growing pain, it's interesting. When a team makes an analytics hire, a lot of times that hire is attached to one person in the front office. They'll say, this GM is analytics friendly, so he brought in this, you know, this kid or these kids. And fairly or unfairly, Tyler was attached to the coach in Edmonton, Dallas, who was on stage here last year. Dallas gets fired. There's a regime change in Edmonton. Peter Chiarelli comes in. Can you just speak, Tyler, to now there's a regime change. You've got to win over a whole new person. And I mean, clearly you're on the stage as an Edmonton Oiler employee. It went well. What was that process like?
It's a bit of a challenge. I think the most important thing to remember if you're the analytics guy is you're probably pretty low on the list of priorities when there's a new GM coming in. So just keep your head down. And really, it's like anything else. Like, Dallas played a big role in bringing me into Edmonton, but so did Scott Housen. And, as you get exposed to people in the organization and they see how you think and what you're thinking about and the kinds of arguments you can make, I think my experience has been that you start to kind of grow your network of people beyond the one person who said, hey, or maybe the two people who said, hey, this is somebody we should hire.
Yeah.
So then when you get to the point where you're dealing with a change, you're in maybe a bit of a better position because, you might have more people in the organization who sort of know a bit about you or the kinds of things you think or the ideas you have and how best to approach things. So that maybe makes it a bit of a case where the new person has some information from other people in the organization saying, yeah, this guy can maybe add some value.
Yeah. So I'm looking out in this audience and I see people that I know are working for teams. It's more and more every team has somebody in the front office. I'm not sure we can say right now there's an NHL team that every decision is driven by analytics. How long until you guys think, and I want to bring Tim back into this conversation, how long do you think until we have a team that's all in and everything is driven by analytics first in hockey?
Well, I don't think that'd be a good idea.
Okay.
First off, but I think the team I work for does a pretty good job with it. I mean,
Yeah.
There's been a lot of work done in sports analytics and hockey analytics, but it's just today, more money will be spent analyzing securities analytics, more time, effort, and money than will ever be spent on hockey from now until forever.
Right.
And in that venue, most traders, it's probably 70% math, 30% feel. So where that line is in hockey, I'm not sure, but it's always, I feel like we integrate that into it. It's not just it's not a separate thing. I work with the pro scouts and with the GM and sort of try to work out what's the right way to bet it. And I'm more about pricing, where I would buy, where I would sell, player contract.
Right.
And I think we will do more with analytics as I get better at it, I guess, me and HT. But for now, I think they're betting it the right way. So I can only speak for my own experience. I know other people that work in analytics for other hockey teams, basketball and baseball teams. That's not their situation. I'm pretty fortunate.
Yeah.
But it's. I think I don't want to say we're all in. Like nobody's going to run totally like when Paul DiPodesta got the first job in Anaheim. It's just like 100% analytics. That
Why
wasn't
not?
a good idea then, and it's
why
not a good
doesn't a
idea
team
now.
do that? Just because there's too much feel?
Because it's not a good idea, as Tim said.
It wasn't a good idea in baseball either. There's a lot of different factors at play. There's a lot more. For one thing, it's never perfect, and the other thing is the scouts are going to see things that the math isn't going to catch. It should line up. I mean, the math it's like judging a poker player by the chip stack. They need to play a lot of hands before I can tell you, and it's more the range of error just gets narrower and narrower. I'm still never sure, and it's a moving target. Players change, their games change.
Yeah.
So I think it's a matter of sort of incorporating that all in a reasonable way, and trying to make good decisions where you know your risk. We're going to make bad trades. We're going to sign bad deals, but we know the risks we're taking on, and I think we're in a pretty good spot. I think the market as a whole, even people who aren't using analytics, is pretty good as well. By the way.
Right.
So there's that. It's not easy. There's 29 other teams that are all pretty smart.
Right.
And it's and there's not that much liquidity. You go 2 times a year when there really trades and signings happen.
So what I'm hearing on some level, and you hear this a lot, is in hockey there are so many things that you can't measure, and I want to touch on a couple of those things and see if really there is a way for analytics to figure out some of these things. And one of the things is chance or luck in hockey. Like Chris, you're playing a playoff series, and it can be an even series. Like what percentage just comes down to what team got luckier and the puck went off someone's skate?
Well, I think if you ask any team that wins a Stanley Cup or any kind of championship, you need luck. You need puck luck. You need those bounces to go your way. You need to be healthy. you need to have that luck, and you need to be playing your best at a certain time, and that's luck as well.
Right.
You know, you got to be lucky to win. And can you measure that? I don't know.
Can you measure that? Is there a way to? It seems to me like if I'm running a team and I'm a GM, I'll just be like, bad luck every year. So, you know, like can't measure luck, so we're out of, you know.
So some teams seem to explain
Not
it away.
naming any names, but like Tyler, let me loop you in. Is there a way to, okay, this, let's try to eliminate or factor in 20% of it's going to be out of our control. Like, what is that number? How do you factor that into your?
I don't know. I
decision?
think it depends on what it is. Like there's some things that we know are more luck driven than other things. Like 1-goal games are really luck driven. So when you see something that you think maybe doesn't seem right, there's kind of a list of things you can run through to sort of see if there's any kind of things that are red flags that maybe there's some chance involved, either good or bad, that might explain why you're seeing what you see. So
Yeah.
I think it'll depend on, you know, you said if you were a GM, you'd say every year you got unlucky. Well, you better have a good argument to back it up. Because if you're like, yeah, we got unlucky.
No, puck luck. I think that's all you have to say.
No, well, maybe with some people. I think other people might cast a more critical eye at just blaming puck luck all the time.
Yeah. Tim, where are you at on chance? Like what?
But I really think Tyler's largely right there. I mean, mostly you're looking at, if you're out working and out playing and out chancing, so much of it just does come down to that one bounce, you know, that cross-ice pass on a PK that could have gone for a shorthanded breakaway, but instead went to somebody who got a really good look and scores a
Right.
goal. It's just, you can go through whoever won a cup and look at a goalpost where they could have lost in the first round, or it is going to be there, but what you can control is out working, out playing, and out chancing to a large extent, and a lot of it is in the hands of the hockey gods, you know.
Oh, hockey gods and luck. That's going to go real well in the analytics conference.
And there's a difference between luck in a game and luck over a season.
Okay.
You can explain luck in a game a little bit that way, but that's probably not going to replicate itself 82 times.
Right.
See, I disagree with that. I think every year there's 1 or 2 teams, and people are like, what? And then so people are, you know, people like me are maybe sometimes a bit surprised by it, and then we read all summer about how great they are, and then the next year they don't do very well, and they say that they stopped working hard. Like there seems to be, to me, to be sort of a pattern that repeats over and over there. So, you know, you're not going to get 30 teams that are lucky or unlucky for 82 games. Like for most teams, the record tells the truth.
But there are
But every year
outliers,
there's 1 or
That's
2
true.
teams.
Who's
you
that
know,
this year?
I never ever comment on that.
Right. Gary Bettman said something earlier today that I wrote down. I thought it was interesting, and then I threw out that piece of paper. So I'm going to have to paraphrase it. And I don't think he's here, so I don't think he can correct me. He said, in talking about analytics, he said, that's all fine and good. The numbers are great. But if the guys in the dressing room don't like each other, you're not going to win. Now, that, again, talking about unmeasurable things in hockey, how do you deal with that? If you're an analytics guy in a front office and you're like, hey, trade for this guy, and I'm sure someone would say, that guy's bad, you hear bad in the room. Like, Doug, I want to bring it, like, you've been in dressing rooms, you've seen when the chemistry is good and it's bad.
Yeah,
Can a team overcome a bad chemistry? And how do you factor that into team building and analytics and analysis?
Well, it definitely has an effect on your performance levels. You know, if your team is a tight team, they're close, they'll battle for each other, and the consistency of everything that's trying to be accomplished is at a high level, you'll perform well. And you know, I think that it has a huge factor on those 1-goal games, battles won, battles lost, puck possession, that sort of stuff.
Guys liking each other?
Yeah, I think it has a huge factor in it. I think the elevation of work ethic is higher.
See, that, like, I mean, we're talking about analytics and quantifying things. That would be discouraging if I'm an analytics guy and I'm like,
Yeah, I don't know
I'm
how
trying
you'd
to-
measure that
Yeah.
necessarily, but I can tell you that being on very, very successful teams that are in the Stanley Cup playoffs and teams that were on the bottom of the 30-team,
Yeah.
and there's a huge difference, and a lot of that has to do with talent, but a lot of it also has to do with closeness and working working with each other.
Tyler wants to say, he leaned forward, that's why.
I'm just, like, I struggle with this. I have a hard time with it. Like, so let's say there's a team that last year had a great record in 1-goal games, and this year their record's not so good. But all their other numbers, the guys that me would look at, are as good or better. Like, they're doing better possession-wise. They're just not winning the 1-goal games. Would you say then that maybe the players don't like each other as much as they used to?
No.
But that's what I don't get.
No, there's a lot of variables. There's a lot of variables in this. But all I'm saying is that I think the level of success that can be gotten through a team that works hard is higher than one, because they like each other, because they'll work with each other. And I think that has an impact on that.
So, Chris, you get traded to a Boston Bruins team that was really good. You get thrown into a playoff race. That, just from the outside covering that team seemed like a tight team, and the one that seemed to get along well. How can you tell that when you walk right into a room, you're like, okay, this is a group of guys that are, does it feel any different than a team that isn't like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right away, it just had a different feeling about the group. I came from Ottawa, where
Everyone hated each other?
didn't hate each other, but we didn't win a game in January, and when the team's
Tweet
not
that
doing,
out.
when the team's not doing well, all of a sudden it's I need to do well as an individual. When I got to Boston, the team was doing well, and I've told this story several times. We were in in Calgary, and we were on a road trip, and it was early on there, and I'm just coming from Ottawa, where everyone's concerned about how many minutes they play, what they got, and kind of toxic group. Where I got to Boston, Patrice Bergeron and David Krejci were 1A, 1B, whatever way, and Gregory Campbell and myself were the bottom two centers. That night we played more than both of them. Not a word was said. Everyone was happy. The team was doing well. Right away I knew it was a special group, just by the way that it was a team-first mentality.
Yeah.
Is that always going to happen? Not always.
All the analytics guys wanted Patrice Bergeron to play more, though, that game, I think.
I want him to play more.
All right, so kind of in talking about the immeasurables in hockey and how we can measure them, there's a phrase that you hear all the time when you talk to scouts and coaches. Mike Babcock said it again when they called up all their young players, and he said, I want to find out which of my guys have hockey sense. Hockey sense it's huge. Like, everyone talks about hockey sense. And again, if I'm building an analytics staff, I want to somehow identify, if this is the most important thing you can have in a player, I want to identify it and try to quantify it. So identifying it's the first step, and I'm going to bring you back in, Chris. You've heard that phrase, I'm sure, all your life. What does it mean? The player's got hockey sense. What is he doing on the ice?
I think he makes good reads. He knows where to be on the ice. He knows where the puck's going to be, not only in the offensive zone, but in all three zones. Being hurt this year, I watch a lot of Bruins games, and obviously, and you see a player like Patrice Bergeron, who seems to be in the right place all the time, and I'm sure there's not a hockey person out there that doesn't think he has excellent hockey sense.
Yeah, he's like the
poster child.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, but I don't know how you measure that. Some guys have great offensive instincts. Some guys have great defensive instincts. It's just, if you can get someone that has all of it, then you got a good player. So,
Frank, you do a lot of analytics work. You're measuring a lot of things. Do you try to figure out what hockey sense? Are there analytics that say, if this guy's doing this over and over again, he probably has good hockey sense? Or
I think what you can measure is the player making good, high probability decisions, and particularly relative to the situation.
Okay.
In certain parts of the ice. And that you can measure because you do know who's on the ice, and you do know where they are, and you do know the situation. So you can measure those things, and then you can start to make inferences from them on whether call it hockey sense, or you call it clutch, or whatever you want to call it. Those things can be measured. Is it 100% foolproof? No. And like Tim said, there are traders today making bets on inanimate objects like stocks that are 70-30 data feel. So there's always going to be a feel component to it, but we can measure that now, and we can measure it more than we ever have been able to.
So Tyler, what's that percentage where you're comfortable in terms of data and feel and saying, okay, I'm sure you've watched guys in Edmonton, you're like, he just doesn't have that sense. Even though this number may look good, there's got to be some feel that you're comfortable as an analytics guy to accept, right?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. It's funny though, like I saw Bill James wandering around here earlier, which is kind of cool, and I said hi to him. And I remembered I've got all his old baseball abstracts at home. And in one of them, there's a story about, he calls it the elephant, it's like an elephant in the snow. If there really was an elephant in the snow, you'd see tracks, so you'd be able to find evidence. And he was talking about whether or not Ozzie Smith was a good shortstop. And so when I hear people say, oh, hockey sense, to me, it has to show up in the results. And if it doesn't show up in the results, even if you take into account, you know, who he's playing against and who he's playing with, if you can't find some evidence in the results that the guy, you know, drives those results or produces those results, then I kind of find the whole discussion about hockey sense to be a little bit beside the point. That being said, like just as somebody who knows, you know, the numbers for a lot of players and who pays attention to the league, I find that a lot of the people say, oh, this guy's got hockey sense, you go look, and the numbers say so too.
So what are those numbers?
Well, it depends. It depends on the player. Like I do care a lot about how a guy impacts on you know, puck possession or Corsi. That's a big one for me. So that's, you know, it really does depend on sort of the specific circumstance you're looking at. But Corsi's a big one for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I sort of paint with a big brush, so I'm not looking at the details. It's got to show up in the result. If you're good, sooner or later things are going to go your way. That's the thinking. But I do find the pro scouts they're, you know, trained and practiced at doing that. They spot hockey sense really well. And I just know we can have a conversation. There's just some words that I know they're going to say. If they got, you know, good hockey sense, structure, detail, I know he's going to show up green for me, like without even looking. Because those are, if they have, you know, obviously you have to have speed and stick skills.
Right.
But those things, and also that's skill, speed fades, but you know, smart is forever. So it's a player you feel a bit more comfortable with as an older player as well. There's a, like I say, I don't think I'll ever go and try to find a way to measure hockey sense with math.
You wouldn't even try
because I'm looking at it from 30,000 feet off the ground, and the people that are doing it in the trenches are pretty good at spotting it already. So I just don't see much edge to trade there.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, so we've been talking a lot about, you know, the players and you know, what they're doing on the ice. I want to pan out a little bit and get into cap management and roster building. And Tim, you sent an email, and we've kind of referenced portfolios. And this is going to sound really cold, and I hate that there's a player on the stage next to me, so I'm not going to make eye contact with them. But, you know, you start talking about players as assets, right? And it sounds, you know, they're not assets, obviously. But this, but this asset carries a lot of risk. This asset doesn't. Is there a way to remove yourself and build a roster doing it that almost as financially?
I think you have to. You have to look at the roster as, I mean, you own a player contract. You don't own a player. But you have the player contract, and you want positive edge here, and it's like a portfolio. It all has to fit together. We can look at the, you know, walking in at the deadline, and you know, McClellan's going to ask, you know, if we get this guy, how much does that change our odds of winning a playoff round, our odds of winning the cup? And
that's the question you're asking at the trade deadline?
That's being asked.
Yeah.
And what if this team gets that guy, and he makes like twice the impact to them? So it's not just a, you know, the contract has different value to different people, the style of game they play, their needs. You know, so but it's still that's what, for me, that's what I'm always looking at. I'm always looking at edge to contract. Where can we find edge in a portfolio? Just edge in general. That's what I'm paid to do. And it's hard because everyone else, the other 29 teams are pretty good.
Right. So, like, I don't know if this is the conversation you had with Mac at all, but Andrew Ladd is a player who is available at the trade deadline. If the Washington Capitals were rumored to be on him or whatever, if they trade for Andrew Ladd, he's playing on your third line, most likely. Whereas the Chicago Blackhawks, who ended up giving up a big package for Andrew Ladd, he's playing on their top line. So that's, Andrew Ladd in this scenario has more value to the Chicago Blackhawks. So, without naming names, but do you say, okay, this guy gives us like, what's that percentage increase to win a round? Like, how do you calculate that?
Well,
I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to state secrets. Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
I think he makes an interesting point, though. Like, the whole trade deadline thing is interesting to me just because I tend to think so often there's moves made outside of when Boston got Chris in 2011 that have marginal impact on the team's chances.
That was a 40% chance of increasing the
Buy
Stanley
him
Cup.
a beer later.
that have a marginal impact on how likely the team really is to win the Stanley Cup. And it's, when you think about over the course of a year, how much does one player really affect the game? It's hard to come up with the answer that it's a lot for most players. Like, there's a few players for whom it's going to be a great deal, but for a lot of players, it's hard to conclude that adding this guy or that guy is going to make, this is my perception, going to make a huge difference to your odds of, winning over the last 20 games of the season and then into a playoff round. Now, I think the one caveat to that, and it's interesting, like you bringing up Andrew Ladd kind of reminded me of this, is if you do have like a black hole somewhere in your team that you can fill or fix. And like, the classic example for me is with goalies. And, in 2006, the Oilers got Dwayne Rollison. In 2008, Washington got UA from Montreal, and they went on a huge run. And then in 2011, Tampa got Rollison again. And in all three of those cases, you had a good team that had sort of a very specific problem, and they were able to fix it. It made a huge difference. But in general, I think it's harder at the trade deadline to make that kind of a move. Chris accepted.
Frank, you had your Bernie Sanders hand.
Can I talk? Can I have as much time as he did? I think that's a great point, and I think, there's so much. If you go into that war room and take the overall dynamic of what's going on organizationally, and the business side is in your ear, we got to do something. The fan base, the owners texting you, are we doing anything? Boston just did something. And it's good now to have that contrarian, dispassionate voice in the room that is looking at it from an asset standpoint and saying, trying to filter out that noise that does impact you or can impact you at times like the deadline or at times around the draft that are very dangerous times for teams. Like, the deadline is so dangerous. You're better off doing nothing half the time.
Right. So you've been in a million war rooms on trade deadline. How many of those trades are made on emotion? Like, Chicago just made a move. We gotta do something. And you just throw the numbers out the window.
I would say in the past, maybe more so than now.
Yeah.
And I think you're starting to see the effects of some of this analysis taking hold.
Yeah. Now, the other thing in terms of salary cap and building a roster is there's been a lot of work done in age analysis, and you don't want to commit too much money to a guy whose best days are behind him. And I'm asking Chris a question after I said that. This is not a reference to you at all.
It'll be all right.
Not at all.
No. But I wanted to ask you, so like, I think people will look at numbers and say the prime age of an NHL player is younger than traditionally believed. And let me ask, throw an age. Like, what do you guys believe the prime age? Can you say that? Would you be comfortable saying that?
Well, I think there's a lot of studies out there that say, points peak around 25 or whatever.
Okay, 25.
So, and it's interesting if you're familiar with other sports, like baseball's 27. I know in soccer you tend to see like strikers peak relatively young. So it's not just one sport. There seems to be a big body of evidence about that from a lot of sports.
Okay. And so let's say it's 25. Like, you and I were talking yesterday. Right away you said, it's 27, right? Like, that seems to be
That's what I thought.
That's what. As a player, like, what do you observe, or how did you feel at your peak? Like, what age? How much experience in the league? Do you think a 23-year-old or a 24-year-old is better than a guy that's had, games under his belt and that experience? Like, how do you balance that?
Well, I think you're seeing hockey's becoming a year-round sport, and these kids are starting at 13, 14, and when they're getting drafted, they're men. They're looking like guys did when they're 27 years old and play in the league for 4 or 5 years. So I'm not surprised that the age is a lot younger than I thought it was. You see these young kids that come in now, and the way they skate, the way they handle themselves on the ice. It's no big surprise that a player is hitting his peak at 23, 24, 25, and hockey's a business, and they want to get the most out of players that they can. And they're not going to go and invest a a big contract and a guy that they feel is, past his prime years.
Right. So Doug, is in what you're studying in terms of creating data on the physical side, can you shift that peak? Can you say we can extend gathering the data and the work that you're doing? Can you extend the peak of a veteran player?
I think the questions that I get with regard to from GMs and coaches and scouts with regard to trades, as an example, at the deadline is has this guy, what's his trend line look? Is he going to be? If they've got to give up a good player to get a good player, and it may be one of your younger players, well, how does he look trend-wise? Has he reached? If he's for instance, his somatotype, he's an ectomorph, which means long, skinny bone, not going to put on a lot of muscle. And
what's that word?
Ectomorph.
Okay.
And
You're
but he's got
not a lot of sports writers are
but
ectomorphs.
he's got potential to get
Right.
get bigger. Where is he on that trend line? Is he going to be able to have a stronger impact and be able to reach the goals that we feel he would be at in another year or two? That's the sort of thing that would be brought to the table with regard to a trade deadline thing. When you're collecting the data that we're collecting and you're looking at strength values, the resistance training values, the levels of fitness, their trend values with regard to work ethic and overall work ethic on a daily basis. And you can have that data and collect it and put it on that player dashboard, and you can put that up on the screen when people are talking about whether or not they want to move them or keep them in the organization. And I think you can actually see those values. If you're doing a skate test and your indices are power, speed, agility, endurance, in that skate test, if he's 27 or 28, 29 years old and he's still doing the same thing he was doing when he was 23 or 24, I like that. And I like that a lot because he's a leader. He's the captain of one of the assistant captains of his team. And does he have an impact on how that team moves forward, in the next 2 or 3 years? And you got to weigh that with all the other stuff that's on the table as well. But the bottom line is that, you can see those trends. You know what you have.
Is there one physical attribute that typically drops off faster among hockey players as they age? Is it skating? Is it the legs? Like what?
It would be power.
Yeah.
It would be power. And, that would be one of the things that we would obviously, focus in on and have as one of our key indicators as to whether or not this guy, what does he have for an NHL life left, But you also have to look at the other intangibles. What does he bring to the table otherwise? What does that bring to the room? Like we were talking about, the success of a team based on closeness. And you can trade away a guy and it would make a huge difference in a room.
Yeah. So now you've got veterans. I think if we're talking about this data and these age differences, I mean, the teams all know this information. And yet free agency hits at 26, 27. So a lot of times these teams have to make a commitment. They have to make a decision on players. Tyler, how do you guys as analysts weigh that risk and say, look, let's say Louis Eriksson in Boston is 30 years old. He's going to get a 5 or 6 year deal from somebody, but maybe his best days are behind you. How do you sit there and say, you need those players to win? Like, how do you balance that?
Well, it's funny. I actually go back to a lot of law stuff here. The first is, I used to practice law. The first answer is, my answer to that is it depends. Like, it depends on where your team is.
Yeah.
If you've got a team that's sort of loaded and, really is a legitimate contender if they've got that player on their team, and maybe their window is coming to an end within 2 or 3 years, I can see it making more sense than if you've got a team that's sort of full of young guys that's just starting to get going. Like in that case, it may not make sense. But I think that's more of it's almost as much a question of how do you evaluate your chances of winning in the immediate future, and where are you in terms of whether it's time to go all in or whether you should be holding back. I think the other thing that factors in on that too, where the analytics I think can be helpful, is in terms of understanding, and this is what they call, I always think of this in negotiating terms from law school. It's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So BATNA is the acronym. And so if it's, I really want player A, well, what are if I can't get him, what else could I do? Like, and how good are my other options? And so I think it's kind of a mix of things, and if you're understanding, or if you're comfortable with the analytics, what that can help you do is inform the decision that you're ultimately making.
I see this clock ticking, and I'm in full panic mode over here. We do want to get into what's next, and one of the things Frank and I were talking about, Frank has founded an app that does a lot of crowdsourcing of data for individual players. And going into this, I was talking to some coaches, and we were talking about quality scoring chances. And there's one coach of an NHL team that said, I'm the only one on my staff that's allowed to track scoring chances because I'm the only one that knows what a scoring chance is. I'm consistent. It's not this spot on the ice. If Alex Ovechkin has a shot from over here, I count that as a scoring chance. I know it, and I know the data is always going to be consistent. That's his theory. I like the guy, so I'll let him do that. But Frank, now you're diving into this frontier that's almost it's the exact opposite, not almost. You're crowdsourcing data where instead of an NHL coach determining information, you're asking, and I think a lot of what we see publicly with hockey analytics is a lot of hockey fans watching video and then tracking zone entries. Can that crowdsourced data be as accurate as this coach's data?
That's the challenge, but I think there is value in the views of the crowd, if you will, and I'm certainly making a personal bet on that. And I'm trying to open up what is a closed system that these guys have broken through after being sort of fighting on the outside to get in, and they've broken through it, and I'm trying to open up that war room to the living room and see if I can capture that data and make it relevant to, not necessarily professional teams, but maybe fantasy players. So.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's a guy named Tom Tango, and it's not his real name, but I don't know what his real name is. No one does. He's sort of the Vic Ferrari of baseball, only he's managed to stay anonymous. But he was doing some work for the Cubs. But one of the cool little projects he's done, similar to what Frank's talking about, is he had he calls it the fan scouting report, where he just invites fans to sort of rank players on certain traits. And it was really interesting. Like I just saw something from him recently, kind of contrasting what the fans said with the objective results, and it was amazing how well it lined up. So it's Frank's project sounds interesting. I do think there is something to that, like the wisdom of the crowd.
All right, the last thing I want to do before I've got the iPad next to me to take some questions from Twitter or however it works, is like I look in this crowd and I see people that want to be on the stage doing what you guys are doing, and I want to serve them a little bit here and give them one piece of advice that you would to give to somebody that wants to be doing what you're doing. And Tyler, you took a path. You had a very public, your blog. A lot of people in hockey were reading it. Is that a path you would recommend, or what would you say to somebody out there that wants to work for an NHL team?
I think there's a lot to be said for sort of doing stuff publicly that gets kind of put through the grinder of having lots of smart people reading it and criticizing it. And like Tim and I actually knew each other for a long time back writing on the internet. And we didn't always agree, but Tim's a good thinker. And if he said I was wrong about something, and he sometimes phrased it colorfully, I always took it seriously. And I was better for, I think, having had that criticism. And there's a lot of people, like I get emails sometimes from people saying, hey, I want to work in this. And I've never heard of them. And I pay a lot of attention to what's being written publicly. Like if there's people in here who have blogs, I've probably read your blog if you're writing analytics stuff. And so that to me is really the big one, like make a name for yourself. And with the tools that are available now, there's no reason you can't do it. And the one other thing I'll add, because this wasn't, writing is something that comes comfortably to me, but this one wasn't intuitive, is learn how to program in some language, because it will let you address better questions. And like last year when I was here, I met some guy named Jared Lander, who has an analytics company, and he gave me his book that he wrote about how to code in R. And I'm not a computer programming guy. Like I'm a liberal arts lawyer. I like words and stuff that are nice.
Oh, you like words? I hadn't noticed. Sorry. Go ahead.
You're the worst moderator.
Can I have as much time as him?
So if you're, if programming is not something that you would naturally think of, I encourage people, think about getting into R. It's a really good program.
All right, Tim, one line of advice you would give to somebody that wants your job.
What Tyler said.
Okay. Frank, now I want your opinion because you've been on both sides. You've walked into a front office and made a pitch of an analytics package to a front office. You've sat on the other side of that pitch. What's a mistake people make when they go and make a pitch to a GM?
I would say a little more listening, a little less talking.
Yeah.
Listen to what the client is actually asking for.
Doug, you've been 30 years working in hockey. What's a piece of advice you'd give to somebody that wants to?
Clearly, education all the way through, get a master's degree in science, exercise science, physiology, and then really be well versed in all areas of it, from nutrition to sleep, almost every aspect, get to understand and appreciate the value of it for the athlete.
Chris, how can I get to the NHL?
You need to be an ectomorph.
Ectomorph?
A little less talking.
Thanks. All right. If I can figure this out, we're going to open it up to you guys and the questions. All right. Number one, what type of in-game adjustments are teams making based on analytical data? I love this question. In-game adjustments based on analytics. Does anybody want to take that?
I don't want to say anything about that.
Really?
No.
Just great question though, you guys. I can say in talking to Ken Hitchcock opened up on that. He has spoken publicly about getting the analytic data in terms of matchups and what lines are working and aren't working. But let me phrase it this way for you guys. How much data? How big a sample size do you need? Let's say it's line guys playing together. Can you learn something in a period or a game?
I don't know. I think that's a tricky question. The one thing I'll say about that is it's hard to get it really wrong. Like if you're talking about, you're making a change based on something you see, coaches move lines around so much that I don't know that there's necessarily a ton there. I think people don't overreact either way.
All right. 2, do you consider grit and toughness when evaluating players? Can it be measured, and can you prove why it matters? Grit. That's become like a 4-letter word in the analytics world.
I think you can way overvalue it. I think
Okay.
it has been way overvalued historically.
Chris, how would you define grit? A guy who has grit.
I think someone that's willing to sacrifice. Someone's
Yeah.
willing to block a shot, take a hit, just battle. I think the days of fighting, stage fighting are behind us, but you see a player, I use Adam McQuaid as an example.
Yeah.
He'll be the first one to get in front of a shot, and I think when you look at his game, he plays a gritty game.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything else on grit? You're not going to talk anymore, are you, Tyler? What hockey metrics? I should probably read these first before I read them out loud, but we're just going to plow through these. What hockey metrics are fans not aware of today, but will be in the next few years? What's the next metric in hockey?
No one's going to answer that.
It's a very good question.
The next metric. I get asked about goalie metrics a lot. Are there good goalie metrics yet? In general terms?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think there are a few people out there that got that figured out pretty good. I think the next thing, as far as the sea change is going to be when we're tracking actual player, puck, and goalie.
Yeah.
I think that,
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a very good point.
it's not necessarily, I think that, I think it'll create some volatility as well. I think it'll bring a lot of people into the game. Some people won't bet it at all. Some teams will bet it terribly, and some teams will bet it well. You want to make sure you sort of know what the other guys are going to do. It'll be interesting. I think there'll be a lot of edge market there.
I think what would be interesting, if it ever gets to this point in this league, is if you look at the NFL, you look at their combine as an example, they do a 40-yard dash. Well, everybody knows that a 4.3, is exceptional, and anything below that's unbelievable. And, where's the lines for different positions? And, in my personal opinion, I think we need to know what a certain speed component would be for a hockey player, a certain distance. And I think those metrics can be usable and important. We did speed tests, power tests on the ice, and those numbers, we know what those values are, but everybody else has no idea what those values are.
Frank, you had to.
Yeah, I had the Bernie Sanders finger going. I think not so much metric, but technology, virtual reality, and the ability to integrate it into maybe preparations so that we can get away from as much wear and tear on the athletes, game day skates, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, again, that's one of those things that we're beginning to get. We're getting more information about that when we're attacking it. You know, we realize that over the years, you know, coaches lose 2 or 3 games. You know, they decided they need to send a message to their players. Well, they played those 2 games in 3 nights, and now they're going to go and skate. As the players say, they get bagged. You know, we're in that position now where we're collecting enough of this data to say, you know, that player load is too high, and it's going to increase the chance for injury, and performance levels are not going to be reached.
Do coaches listen? If you, I mean, are
you
they
know,
receptive to that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's getting to that point where, you know, it was for me.
If you do nothing else, can you get an on-ice component to the draft combine so we can measure some of that?
So I was really shooting for that
Yeah.
for the last 3-4 years, and that's what I'm saying, that, you know, there would be a speed component involved with that, you know, positionally, you know. I don't know if that'll ever come to fruition, but that was something I was really shooting to try to get done.
If you guys don't realize that the NHL holds a draft combine, and for years they just did it in a hotel. Like, there's no on-ice component, there's no, but I can tell you, guys who can bike until they throw up. Did you do that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the VO2.
VO2 straight to Wingate.
Did you puke?
Yes.
Yeah. That's how they judge the
That's
draft
it.
picks. If you puke.
Yeah, if you puked, you worked hard.
Right.
He's got grit.
He's got grit. Do front offices measure errors such as intercepted passes, lost possessions, and missed shots? And we're not going to count the stat sheet, the turnovers, whatever. Yeah. So an intercept. So yeah, what happens when a guy passes a puck? What's his completion percentage? Is that all being tracked?
I think there's a lot of stuff, a lot of more detailed stuff is tracked at the coaching level.
Yeah.
And as you're, and on a player personnel side where I work, it tends to be a bit more big picture. And once you've narrowed things down, then you dig deeper. You should be watching video or looking at specific aspects of a player's game. But at the coaching level, absolutely. There's a ton, a stunning amount of information being tracked. I don't think the players themselves know how much is being tracked and recorded. I'm certain they don't. But when you're looking player personnel, it's more of a big picture game, and it's sort of a different process there.
Do you want to see those numbers? Like if you, I could tell you your completion percentage on every pass you make.
I think you'd like to know. I think it's another tool, and the game's changing. If you're not adapting to these things, then you're going to be left behind. So as a player, I'd like to know, where I stand compared to other players.
Yeah.
And there are companies collecting that data as well.
Yeah. You don't work for any of them, do you?
Not really.
Chris Kelly, as a defense, I'm reading this in the voice of the fan who wrote this. Chris Kelly, as a defensive forward, is there a stat that you looked at to determine how well you played?
Plus minus.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if as a defensive forward, most times you're playing against other teams' top lines. If you're able to come out even or better, you have a better chance of winning. So plus minus is important to me.
Good. Can someone explain Yager?
Genetics.
Well, I've traded him twice. So.
Yeah. How'd that work out for you?
Well, I'm sitting up here.
There's a question being typed as I'm looking. I'll let this guy finish it. What is the state of data visualization? If I can't say it, I hope you guys know what that means. In hockey today, where do you see it going? Tyler, you nodded like you knew what I was trying to say anyways. Data visualization.
Visualization. The question's a little vague. Like, there are a lot of people putting out stuff. Like, my Twitter feed constantly seems to be full of people with graphs and whatnot.
They're unreadable. I'm sorry.
Yeah, actually, I hate to say it, but I kind of agree with that. Like that to me, going back to advice for people, and it depends on your market, right? Like I used to have people complain about my blog posts on my blog that were written for an audience of 500, and I didn't really care if other people didn't get it. So if that person, if those people are just aiming for a few people who get those things, and
Right.
God bless, go ahead. But if you're trying to hit a larger market, I think simpler is always better. Like don't try and show 8,000 things in one picture. Pick
Right.
one and really zero in on it. So I don't know. It's some of it's really good. Like there's some great stuff I've seen, like just visualizing pairings for defensemen, and that's fantastic. But I think you got to kind of pick and choose a bit.
Okay, this is good. How do you weigh different leagues' metrics, both developmental and international leagues? And I'm going to throw a third part to this. Has the AHL, you couldn't even get a time on ice in the AHL for a while. Like, have you guys seen any growth in the developmental leagues in terms of those stats?
I really wish that there was more data available, and I think for all the people out there that are offering to basically do analysis, and usually it's multivariate regressions, that is not what NHL teams need. They just want better data for those other leagues, and they know what to do with it. So I think that if there is someone out there selling that product, you see this, as you see that a lot with trading. People have made a lot of money doing things like just getting satellite photographs of how many cars are parked outside Nordstrom before earnings. That's just the data.
Yeah.
Don't tell people how to trade Nordstrom. Just show them how many cars are in the parking lot. And that's sort of, I really wish there were more people out there providing that.
You guys hear that? One of you guys go out and track AHL data and then sell it to a team. You'll make a lot of money. Right? I would.
That's a challenge, though, is collecting data, is collecting quality data. And that company that I sort of work for is one of the things that we've tried to do. And if someone in this, that is the opportunity, I think, as Tim says, for the next wave of analysis.
You find one player, if you can get one player out of the AHL that some team, just using data that pays for itself. Chris, what do players want to know about themselves stat-wise that maybe you're not getting?
Well, I think we're getting lots, and I think we're getting more than we
Than
know.
you know, yeah.
Yeah. I think all players, we get sheets after every game about, how many minutes we played, shift length, hits, missed shots, giveaways, takeaways, face-off percentage, and every player, I'm pretty sure in the league, looks at those sheets after every game. But if there was more stats, I'm sure we'd look at them as well.
Can you be overloaded? Like, I think some guys would rather just hop over the boards and play, right? Not know.
Players are pretty selfish. They want to see their stats at the end of the day.
How much are you guys comfortable sharing? Like, Tyler, I've heard Taylor Hall references Corsi. That makes me nervous for some reason. I don't know why, but.
It's a bit of a complicated question. I was working more closely with the coaches last year.
Yeah.
And my philosophy was very much that, to the extent that I was interacting with the players, my job was to deliver the coaching staff's message. And so if a player asked me something or was curious, I'd frequently go to the coaches and say, hey, this has come up. Here's what I think the numbers say. But any response, I think, has to come from the coaches. So again, I'm very deferential to coaching staffs on those things. I think ultimately, the ship's got to have one captain, and however that person wants it run is how it needs to be run.
Yeah. This is a good question because I think people make this mistake. What's the difference between statistics and analytics in hockey? Because Corsi's just shot attempts, right? Or not, it's not like we're. Is there a line where you say, okay, this is analytics and these are just stats?
When I started calling it analytics, I started getting paid for doing it. So.
Is there a journalism equivalent of analytics that I can start? Chris, what do other players think of analytics? Do you guys talk about it? Does it ever come up?
A little bit, maybe not as much as it should, because that's the way the game's heading. Is knowing what a player can bring and any given night. But I think we'll see it more and more. Guys be more interested in it.
Awesome. Well, you guys did awesome. Give it up for these guys. They were unbelievable. We're going to wrap it up.
Go ahead.
All right. What's it? All right.